The Reverend Dr. Joseph Lucas is an Orthodox Christian priest, theological scholar, and practical philosopher. He received his Ph.D. in theology from the St. Irenaeus Orthodox Theological Institute at Radboud in the Netherlands. And we want to thank you for joining us, Father Joseph.
Thank you for having me.
So as you well know, a central figure in the Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox dialogue is St. Cyril of Alexandria. And I understand that you've actually done your doctoral work on St. Cyril?
That's correct. I focus mostly on his biblical interpretation, his unpacking or exegesis of the Bible, and a lot of theological terms came up within that. Of course, I had to be very versed in St. Cyril's writings as a whole, including all his dogmatic works, which some of them are from before the Nestorian controversy in 428, and some the majority of them are from after. The more famous ones are from after the controversy arose. So I spent over 10 years, probably about 13 years, working on Cyril exclusively, or primarily, we'll say.
Well, that will make this interview really a critical part of our project, and so we really appreciate you joining us. So he died actually prior to the 451 Council. Is that accurate?
That's correct. He died in 444. So that's about 7 years, 6-7 years prior to the to 451, when the Council of Chalcedon was called.
And what can you tell us about him? Maybe just a little bit of a history.
Well, Saint Cyril, a lot of the backstory is essentially pieced together by scholars. It's hard to sometimes, he doesn't have a biography. A lot of the biographers that wrote about him afterward were a bit biased against him for various reasons. But some of the things that we can be pretty sure of, since he was the nephew of the Patriarch Theophilus, Saint Theophilus, his predecessor in Alexandria, that he was groomed for this position probably from an early age. So he probably would have gone through the standard paideia, which is the educational program that would have been typical at the time, learning grammar, learning philosophy, and all these things as preparation, before going into the ranks of the clergy. He would have gone at some point through the lower ranks of the clergy. There's different traditions from some centuries later that discuss about the times that he went through those different ranks, the reader and deacon and of course presbyter, before becoming a candidate to be the bishop of Alexandria. And so he had a very good formation. He was very well educated. Some people try to say something to the contrary, that he wasn't very philosophically inclined, but I think that's been dispelled by a few academic works that focused just on his philosophical influences and showed that he would have had a standard and solid education in that regard. And then from the time he took over as the patriarch, he was there a very long time. He was there over 30 years as patriarch in Alexandria. So it's a very long career. And his primary academic output, you could say, if you want to use a modern term of academics, his primary literary output or research output was mostly biblical commentary. He did produce, as I mentioned, some dogmatic works early on. He had, for example, a work against the Arians, even though Arianism was kind of a thing of the century prior. There were still some lingering Arian sentiments floating around, and also it was just the idea of looking at it again, because it could always reemerge. So he had some works that were dogmatic in nature, but most of it's biblical commentary, and you find a lot of theology in his biblical commentary. One of the things that people don't realize is that he was well aware of the Nestorian controversy way before Nestorius was a known entity. So Diodore of Tarsus was the first writer to start mentioning this idea of two sons. And very early in his commentaries, probably from 412, 413, he's in the early part of his career writing, and he's already condemning what he doesn't call him out by name, but he's saying some people are talking in this way, and he says this idea of two sons, and he's already dismissing it. So he's had a lot of time to prepare for Nestorius to come on the scene. When Nestorius emerges, Saint Cyril had already been engaging with the problems in Diodore of Tarsus's works for a couple of decades, actually.
Well, it's no wonder he is a central figure in the discussion about the Ecumenical Council of Chalcedon and the division that took place between now what is known as the Oriental Orthodox and the Eastern Orthodox, Chalcedonian Orthodox. And fascinating to me, Father, that apparently St. Cyril is a saint for both traditions. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah. He's a common saint, which is very good because this is one thing that I think can be a bridge point between the two traditions. Is looking to Saint Cyril, having a whole reading of Saint Cyril, a complete reading of his works and what he in his inheritance has given us to help bridge this gap and help with the goal of helping to bring the Oriental back into communion with the Chalcedonian Orthodox Church.
Well, as you mentioned, he reposed prior to that Council of Chalcedon, but would it be fair to say that his name was invoked a few times on both sides?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it was, of course, the opponents of what was happening in Chalcedon, mostly, of course, Evtychis was, the one who was condemned, and eventually condemned also later on by the Oriental Church as well. Even Dioscorus, the patriarch at the time of the calling of Chalcedon, the patriarch of Alexandria at the time, even he would kind of like distance himself from Evtychis at a certain point. But Saint Cyril, what most people don't understand is that when we read through the Acts of the Fourth Ecumenical Council, Saint Cyril theology remained the standard of orthodoxy for everyone present. Nobody was challenging Saint Cyril. No one was saying, "Oh, we need to come up with something apart from what Saint Cyril had already left them, what he had already taught." They saw it as really an extension of his work. And so, for example, when the famous Tome of Saint Leo was presented, this Latin tome from the Pope of Rome, it was scrutinized for days. The bishops had to make sure that it jibed with the writings of Saint Cyril, and that the tome presented this idea of two natures, or a diophysite understanding of Christ. They had to make sure that this was in some way reflecting what Saint Cyril himself had taught. And so it was only after some days of examination that they said, okay, we think that it's in line with Saint Cyril. And they even say that in the Acts, that they came to that conclusion. In the end, the formula that was adopted at Chalcedon, the official statement, it doesn't really quote at any length anything from the Tome of Saint Leo. It's essentially pulled from some of Saint Cyril's writings. So, for example, the four famous adjectives that are used to describe the two natures and how they interact with one another. These terms you've probably heard them before. You have unchangeably, atreptos in Greek; undividedly, which is adiretos in Greek; unconfusedly, asynchitos in Greek; and inseparable, achoristos. So all these terms that were used, of them, three of them were taken right out of Saint Cyril's letter to Sixensis. They were things that he had written about, and they were derived from there. And the final one is in line with the others. There's nothing really saying inseparable. It's not really anything but an extension of the other three to make it even clearer. You notice that all of them have in English it would be an A, or in Greek an alpha at the beginning. It's called the alpha privative in Greek, and they have an apophatic sense. So in apophatic theology, we describe what God is not, rather than placing limitations on him by saying what he is. So each of those is saying what he's not. He's not this union, this hypostatic union, this union of the person of the Son with human nature. That union that he remains unchangeable, undivided. All these things we're saying are placing limitations on what we can consider, and so therefore, it's a proper reflection of what Saint Cyril was trying to put across. There's a famous quote later on the letter of Sixensis that makes it clear. This is what Saint Cyril actually writes to Sixensis. He says, "And so we unite the word of God the Father to the holy flesh endowed with a reasonable soul, in an ineffable way that transcends understanding, without confusion, without change, without alteration." Those were three terms. "And we thereby confess one Son in Christ and Lord, the same united God and man, not someone alongside someone else, but one and the same, who is and is known to be both things." So this is the main point that Saint Cyril was trying to put across, and this is, this letter itself is a primary source used and approved at the council. And it really does reflect, I think, Saint Cyril's desire to make sure that what we're talking about here, what is referred to as this hypostatic union, is all about single subjectivity. The one Son of God or Word of God is that same one who became man. He became flesh, and not somebody else. Not like Nestorius thought that they were two alongside one another, or two sons that were united through a union of goodwill, which is what Nestorius had said at one point. That's what we're rejecting, and that's why Chalcedon uses the words of Saint Cyril to try to get that point across.
Interesting. Well, when I invited you to this interview, you told me, and you kind of alluded to this earlier today too, that a whole reading of St. Cyril's writings would be the best way to approach reconciliation with the Oriental Orthodox churches. How so?
Well, I think for one thing, we have to look at how Saint Cyril is writing after the council. That's one important aspect of this, because Saint Cyril, although he was very strict in how theological terms should be described and terminology used, as all the fathers are, they know that language is important. You don't use the words incorrectly or imprecisely. You have to make sure that everyone is on the same page, that we have the same definitions for the terms that are used. So that was his intention. But at the same time, he came to recognize, or maybe he always knew from the beginning, that other interlocutors, other parties that he's engaging, that they might have the correct understanding, but they're using different terminology. And so we find this particularly in his letters and documents after the time of Ephesus, after the Council of Ephesus. So, for example, he begins to write back and forth with St. John of Antioch. And St. John of Antioch, the Patriarch of Antioch, is concerned that the Council of Ephesus too strictly, it was too strictly referring to the oneness of Christ without speaking of the fact that he is both God and man simultaneously. And this was the concern that St. John had. And he wasn't Nestorian in his understanding, and St. Cyril came to understand that as well. And so in his dialogue with St. John, he says, okay, if you're using this two-nature terminology in this way, the way that you're describing to me, the way you're defining, you're saying the same thing as me. So it's not about the terms itself, as long as the terms are defined to mean the same thing. So this is particularly important in St. Cyril's 39th epistle to St. John of Antioch in the year 433. So he endorses the language of another bishop, Bishop Paul, another bishop in the same region, in saying that Jesus is consubstantial with the Father according to his divinity, and consubstantial with us according to his humanity. That's what Paul had said, and in his writings, and that was what St. John was pointing to, and St. Cyril agrees with it. This document, this 39th epistle to St. John, this was entered in as an official document, as a canonical document at the Fourth Ecumenical Council in Chalcedon. So it's more evidence that they were looking at the whole Cyril. They were looking not just at one particular term, like mia thesis, and how he defined it, but how his meaning of it, according to himself, also reflects the understanding of St. John as the two natures doctrine, so long as we understand them in the way that the two of them agreed upon in that exchange of letters, and that's why that document is important. Another thing is just to go through the commentaries, the biblical commentaries that Saint Cyril wrote over over the course of his career, because he commonly speaks about the two natures of the one Lord Jesus Christ in his commentaries. For example, when he's speaking of the high priesthood of Jesus, he first of all makes very clear that this high priesthood is according to his humanity, because he's countering the Arian idea that the high priestly function of the Son of God is eternal, because he was made to be a mediator. He was created to be a mediator. And so by emphasizing that his high priestly function, his role as in this way, is according only to his humanity, he's kind of short-circuiting the arguments of the Arians and making very clear that the Son of Man, through his human nature, does this particular task. Right, so it's so he's speaking here of a way that we can understand the humanity and the divinity working perfectly as because it's one person working through this human nature when he's doing this, when he's acting as the high priest. And I think just in general, a good work that also looks at the way Saint Cyril uses terminology is a work by Dr. Hans van Loon, who's a Dutch scholar on St. Cyril, called The Diophysite Christology of Cyril. And what he looked at, he examined the philosophical underpinnings of Cyril's writings. He looked through to find how he uses terminology, and Hans van Loon showed that St. Cyril uses the word physis not in the sense of like substance in the way that some other writers use it as a synonym for substance or something along those lines, but as referring to a concrete reality. So it's not unique properties of each reality, but this concrete reality of who we're speaking about here. So he's not using it in a imprecise way, but he's using it in a very specific way, and that's why Saint Cyril had to kind of come to terms with the way that the Antiochians were using it, because he realized they're using physis, the word nature, in a different way than he was. Once he realized what they're doing with it, then he could say, okay, now we're saying the same thing. So we have to actually go back through and examine the philosophical underpinnings of St. Cyril, and certain scholars have already done that. So a whole reading of Cyril takes into consideration all of these things: his philosophical background, how he's using terms, his commentaries and other early writings that do speak about the two aspects, the two natures of Jesus Christ, and then also his really conciliatory documents, these writings after the Council of Ephesus, where he is interacting with other people and trying to come to terms with their usage of terminology, so that they agree on these things.
Well, it's hard to speculate, but you just wish he would have been at the Council of Chalcedon. Do you think had he been present in 451, it would have ended differently?
I think so. He may have. He may have really stressed that his 12 anathemas be officially accepted as part of the council. He may have quibbled a bit about the wording in the formula that says that uses the Greek word for "in," so Christ is known in two natures rather than the preposition "from" two natures. He may have quibbled over that, and again, it would have been a dialogue with the other bishops as to what do they mean by this, and whether St. Cyril would have agreed with their understanding of this or not. But I think that overall, he really was present there in a sense, because they're looking to build upon his theology. His name is mentioned throughout. He's kind of lurking there, posthumously, you could say, lurking there in the council the whole time. So I think that had he been present, maybe some little things would have been different in the council itself, but I don't think ultimately it would have come to a different conclusion. It would have still had what we refer to as a diophysite understanding of Christ, because this wasn't that controversial prior to that time.
So it makes me wonder, as we spin forward to today, given some of that clear, whole reading of St. Cyril, who is revered as a saint on both sides. In your observation, have you seen or heard anything explicitly heretical in statements coming from an Oriental Orthodox hierarch or scholar that would concern you?
Not personally. I think that whatever knowledge I have is secondhand. So there was a Coptic scholar named Dr. George Babawi, who was excommunicated by the former Patriarch of Alexandria of the Coptic Church, Shenouda, Pope Shenouda. And he eventually immigrated to the U.S. He lived in Indiana for a while. He actually ended up becoming a member of a Chalcedonian church there, and I had friends that knew him. So it's through his writings and lectures that I came into contact with that I found about his story. And his story is one in which he was involved with a dialogue. I think it was with the Russian church at the time. He was involved with one of these dialogues between the Coptic church and one of the Chalcedonian churches. And he affirmed that the proper understanding of salvation could be described as theosis. And that did not sit well with Pope Shenouda. He was adamantly against this. And so he excommunicated him. And he eventually, after Pope Shenouda passed away, the current patriarch of the Coptic Church, Tawadros, right before Dr. Babawi's death in 2020, about a year or so before his death, he restored him. He lifted the excommunication against him, and there were bishops in the Coptic Church who were still upset with this. They said that the excommunication should not have been lifted because Dr. Babawi was not repentant of his idea of theosis. So that's a big issue for me, because if there are maybe it's not the official teaching of the Coptic Church as a whole, for example, and maybe it's not the official teaching of like the Ethiopian or the Armenian Church, but if it is indeed something that a good many bishops or maybe seminary professors are teaching, this idea that theosis is heretical, then that would be a very big difference in theology between the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental. So that's something I can't confirm from my own experience. I don't read Arabic, so I haven't looked at these documents back and forth myself, but just getting them secondhand through the person whom they affected in his writings, Dr. Babawi.
Yeah, and I've heard at least one Coptic speaker, teacher, particularly a teacher of youth, talk about this as it has to be viewed in the culture of predominantly Islamic rule, where if you say we can become gods, they're already persecuting us, and they're going to persecute us even more if that's the terminology we use. So they may not use the word theosis as often as we wish they would, but according to this particular teacher, who's a clip of him is going to be heard here, he is saying we do believe in theosis.
That's good news. I hope that becomes more
again,
of a
that's one person, right?
Yeah, and I think as an aside, I know that in the Roman Catholic Church, all official theological documents are published in Latin. And I would say that all official theological dialogue and documents should be first and foremost put in Greek, because Greek was the majority language of most of the church for most of the history of the church. It's the language that all the official, the creed was written in Greek. The various dogmatic formulae were all in Greek. Most of the fathers wrote in Greek. And if we're all using a single language to conduct theology in, at least for official documents, and that way we can define the terms officially, it'll cause a lot less confusion, I think, when these things happen, because I've heard before that it was misunderstanding of language and things like that, right? And at the time, some people say that the Coptic language that became more and more used within the church in like the 5th, 6th century also lent to some confusion of these terms. And if that's the case, more evidence that official dialogue should be in a language that's common and where things are easily defined.
That's actually a very good point. So, what would need to happen, Father, for there to be a serious step forward toward reconciliation, in your view?
Well, for one thing, I think that the onus is on the Eastern Orthodox, we who are Chalcedonian Orthodox. I think that we should be the ones to kind of lead this, because for one thing, it's really up to us to understand where they're coming from, because if we truly desire for the Oriental churches to be reunified with, to become part of the Orthodox Church at large, and if we consider ourselves to be the una sancta, the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, then we have a responsibility within the Eastern Orthodox Church to reach out to them, to fully understand where they're coming, to persuade rather than attack, to persuade them, and to try to sit down at the table and to take seriously the work that needs to be done, research and writing and publishing, beyond just small consultations, like to start getting bishops involved and things like that to grow these. Ultimately, though, I do believe that the other councils, that an idea of agreeing to disagree, where the third council is the cutoff point for some churches, and other churches can have other councils, and we can just agree to disagree. I don't think that is. I don't think that's an effective or possible way of reunifying. I think that there's a single or continuous movement of theology throughout all the councils, and even beyond those councils, beyond the 7 councils, to the provincial councils, going up through the Palamite Council, all the way up to the Council of Jerusalem, which had to deal with with the rise of kind of Westernism in the East. All these are cut from the same cloth. They were they met. The bishops worked hard. There was a desire to for all the bishops to have to work these things out in these councils, to have to struggle and learn to work together and establish a theology that was unanimous rather than just a teaching of one individual. And of course, at all the councils, there were important figures whose theology loomed large, like Saint Cyril at Ephesus and Chalcedon. But I think the councils themselves, the conciliar tradition, is something that we need to maintain and see that as the way forward. And the Eastern Orthodox then have this responsibility to persuade, our Oriental brethren to accept these councils and to unify on a proper grounds rather than just this agreement to disagree. Now it gets a little tricky when you're talking about certain figures. So you have, for example, Dioscorus, who's considered a saint in the Oriental Church, or Severus, for example. And that gets a little more problematic. How do we handle this? I think there may be precedents for that. So, for example, Dioscorus, historically speaking, was never excommunicated over a dogma, because in the end he didn't really he wasn't cast out because he was a monophysite. He actually the issue with him is, first of all, the way he ran the Robert Council and how Bishop Flavian's death is kind of, in a sense, on Dioscorus, the way he ran that council and how he did things. And then secondly, at the actual Council of Chalcedon, after the first couple of sessions, he refused to come, even though he was summoned. And so technically he was removed or just deposed from his rank of bishop for disobedience, because the synod and the emperor said he must come, and he refused to. So there could be a sense in which, posthumously he could be returned to the diptychs, to the list of canonical bishops, and this is much in the same way that Saint Cyril himself restored Saint John Chrysostom to the diptychs in Alexandria posthumously, after for a while he was not in the diptychs in Alexandria because of the tension that happened between Saint John Chrysostom and Saint Theophilus.
I don't think I've heard that before. That's interesting.
Yeah, so there's a there's a little bit of a precedent there. Severus, again, a little bit more of a sticky widget. Perhaps, and I'm not a scholar on Severus. I've read some of his writings, but someone who's maybe more adept at Severus's writings can tell you more about that. But it's possible that he could be approached in the same way that the three chapters were approached at the Fifth Ecumenical Council. So, for example, Theodoret of Syr is often referred to as Blessed Theodoret because he was highly revered. Much of his commentaries are free of any kind of Nestorian influence, but not all of them. Some of them, because of who his teachers were, do contain the two sons' theology in there. And so those writings were condemned at the Fifth Council, but he as a person was not. And so that would probably require a large Orthodox synod to look at Severus and say, because Severus had the backing of Empress Theodora. I mean, he was very close to her and had her backing, and there's this tension between her and her husband Justinian. And we look at her and her husband as saints in the Orthodox Church, even though they took different sides on this issue at that time. So that could be something that could be looked at maybe in that way, that maybe any writings of Severus that were highly problematic, if that's the case, maybe those writings be condemned and not him in his person. Because we kind of do the same thing with other individuals as well, where we condemn just their writings, but we don't necessarily point to them as an individual and say that person is a total heretic. Again, this is above my pay grade. It's something bishops would have to work out and determine the best way forward for that.
But it makes me wonder, the way we treat St. Augustine, for example. He is a saint. We call him Blessed Augustine. But, some people look at his writings and have concerns.
Absolutely. And I think, and I don't think that there would need to be a full rehabilitation of, for example, Severus. Because it's fine to say that certain writings are out of bounds or have incorrect ideas within them. And as you mentioned, Saint Augustine, a proper reading of Saint Augustine, I would say from an Orthodox perspective, sees him through the lens of the Eastern or Greek fathers. Right? We read. So anywhere where he would come up with something that would be a bit innovative, that might be problematic, or influenced by something outside of the normal stream of theological thought, we can just put that aside and say, okay, so that doesn't agree with the consensus of the Church. We've always believed in the consensus patrum, the consensus of the fathers, and there are many fathers that you can find an opinion here or there that the Church should not take up. And never will take up for whatever reason, because either it was just speculation, or maybe this person had something that they took up in their theology from another influence and didn't realize at the time that it was problematic, or maybe it's something that gets misinterpreted later. Maybe later writers would use that, and so we have to reject that idea because it could turn into something later on. So that's always been the case in Orthodoxy, that certain writings can be put aside.
Well, so we have the two natures of Christ, but then you go forward to the Sixth Ecumenical Council, where the heresy of monotheletism is dealt with, saying that Christ only had one divine will. And for some Oriental Orthodox scholars, the question stems from the same question about the two natures. One of our panelists said that, well, persons have wills, natures do not. Could you comment on that?
That I don't quite understand where that would come from. The idea that will is according to nature was was already a standard trope for a few centuries prior to the rise of monothelitism. St. Maximus was not saying anything strange. So, for example, when St. Maximus is engaged with the heretic Pyrrhus, he says, if one suggests that a willer is implied in the notion of the will, then by the exact inversion of this principle of reasoning, a will implied in the notion of a willer. Thus, will you say that because of the one will of the superessential divinity, there's only one hypostasis, as did Sibelius? Or that because there are three hypostases, there are also three wills, and therefore three natures as well? For the canons and definitions of the fathers say that the distinction of wills implies the distinction of natures. Even Irenaeus said so. So what he's referring to in that quote, that's I just happen to have that hand because I was reading the other day the dialogue between Pyrrhus and Saint Maximus, and what he's referring to here is that at the time when Saint Athanasius is dealing with the Arians, already in Saint Athanasius there's the understanding that will is according to nature. The Arians agreed with him on that, but the Arians said that it's obvious that Jesus had a different will than his Father, and therefore he has to be a different nature. So they used it in the opposite way than St. Athanasius was. St. Athanasius says the exact opposite. He so for example, there's the famous the famous instance of Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane. Okay, Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, and it would seem like there's this tension of wills, okay, that happens in the Garden of Gethsemane, and the Arians interpreted that as evidence that because there's this tension of wills, Jesus's will, which is according to nature, must be different than the Father's, and therefore having a separate will or different will, he would have a different nature altogether. And so St. Athanasius responds to the Arians with this. This is in his book on the Incarnation. He says, Christ manifests here two wills, theothelamata, two wills, the human will, which belongs to the flesh, and the divine will, which belongs to God. So Saint Athanasius, rather, he absolutely challenges what the Arians are saying. He's saying, yes, absolutely, there are two wills. It's that human will that has to come in, is coming into line with the divine will, but according to his divine will, that is the same as the Father's will, because that's according to nature. The Cappadocians will continue that. They'll use sort of will and energy, which is action, or movement. They'll use them somewhat synonymously and say that the evidence that God is one, for example, St. Gregory of Nyssa, the evidence that God is one is that it's a single energy that comes from the Father through the Son in the Spirit. And then he'll make clear that there's a sense of it's the one energy according to the nature, but we understand it, or we interact with it through the three persons. So it is one nature, but it comes from the Father through the Son in the Spirit. And this is how they understood this. You could take the terminology that St. Leondius of Byzantium later uses a little bit before St. Maximus when he starts referring to things as hypostatic, or there's one natural will according to God's divinity, but we only can interact with persons. So we interact with that one will through the Father, or from the Father through the Son in the Spirit. So it's always the way that God interacts with creation is the three persons, because another common dictum in the Fathers is there's no such thing as nature that is not hypostasized. It has to be, it's not tangible unless it is a concrete reality, an existence of some kind, an hypostasis. So they share one nature, but we interact with them as the nature from the Father through the Son and the Spirit, even though it's one nature. So he definitely has to have a divine will that's according to his nature. And if he definitely has a divine will according to the nature, and if he becomes human, then for him to be fully human, there has to be that nature that is common to humanity, right? It's part of what makes humanity, human, is that we have a will according to our nature. And the problem with our will is that our natural will, St. Maximus would say our natural will is directed towards what is good. A natural will does what it's supposed to do. It's directed towards what is good. And so in becoming man, Jesus takes on that natural will. St. Maximus, this little extra twist on this is that he says that our ability to choose, our freedom, makes it possible for us to alter our will, to change our will, to direct it towards things that are not good, which would be a privation of goodness, a distortion of some kind. And he calls that, a gnomic will, which vacillates. And therefore, by becoming man, the natural human will has to be restored in Christ. This goes back again to St. Gregory the theologian. He says, whatever is not assumed is not healed. This was common to all the fathers after him. St. Cyril believed this, ardently. So the Lord Jesus Christ had to have that human will perfected in himself in order to heal it for our sake, or else our will is not restored back to its original functionality again, being naturally disposed and pointed towards God. So it's very important. It's not something different than what earlier fathers were saying. It's not something different than what St. Cyril implied, in his understanding of things. So I'm not quite sure that reference you gave me, that somehow it is according to person. I think maybe that's projecting how the human gnomic will is onto the Trinity almost, right? This idea that each person has a distinctive individualistic will. Well, that's what St. Maximus would call the gnomic. That's the misuse of the will. And to project that onto God, that would be very problematic.
I wonder if a better way of understanding what is meant by that is the same way we are learning about monophysite or monophysite versus miaphysite. So mono, they don't like mono, they're not monophysites because mono to them means only one. Whereas mia means united. It's the natures are united in the Trinity, fully God, fully man, united. Could we apply that same principle to the wills, that the two wills are united in the person of Christ, who is fully God and fully man?
Well, they certainly are. I mean, there's certainly no sense in any of the fathers, including St. Cyril. When St. Cyril interprets that same passage from Gethsemane, he makes it clear that that humanly speaking, his human desires are in lockstep with the divine will. So I don't think that if we're using that term mia to represent a concrete reality, and the way that St. Cyril understood mia thesis to mean the concrete reality of this unity, and if that were defined, which I'm not aware that it has been by anyone that would be considered a monothelite or a monoenergist. I don't think it's ever been defined as such. But if it were defined as such, as just saying like, we believe that there is a human will, but it is in lockstep with, or subject to, or in union with, total perfect union with the divine will. That's exactly what the Orthodox are saying. What we in the Eastern Orthodox Church are positing. So again, we have to get beyond terminology, like the term miaphysite. If by that they mean what St. Cyril meant by that, then that's fine, because that's St. Cyril meant something very specific by it. And I think that was represented in Chalcedon, even if it was using the Antiochian terminology to do it, to try to make it, so it was kind of balancing these two realities, the two ways of speaking about it, but trying to come to the same conclusion.
Okay, very helpful. So, as we know, in the recent decades, there have been dialogues. There have been several. And the one in the 90s came out with what was called the Second Agreement, where a list of 10 agreed statements were made, and a lot of really celebration over that, although one of our panelists said there's two there that I have a little trouble with, and he kind of expostulated on that. But in terms of the agreement itself, it's my understanding that there has been pushback from a committee of monks on Mount Athos, They kind
Right.
of rejected the conclusions of both recent joint agreements, and it's,
hmm
we don't want to just ignore that. So what are we to make of that reaction?
Yeah. So that's so that the dialogues up through 1993. Those are the ones I think you're referring to. There's a series of them that started back in, I think, in the 60s actually. But there's a series of joint statements of these theological committees with a few bishops on both sides in attendance, but certainly not representative of the bulk of either church, of either the Eastern Orthodox or the Oriental Orthodox. So the last statement was 93 from these dialogues, and it was the year later in 1994 that the monks of Mount Athos then responded back. And a lot of their critiques are ones that I also share, concerns that I also share. So for one thing was this idea that it comes out in the documents that we can sort of agree to disagree about the acceptance of additional councils beyond the third. So this is something that comes across in these joint statements, is that since we mean the same thing when we talk about the two natures, and there was a lot of good agreement there in terms of meaning the same thing when we talk about the two natures and the hypostatic union and that sort of thing. But then the conclusions are, well, maybe it's not necessary to kind of like, rock the boat and insist that the Oriental churches accept the subsequent councils. And again, I think that would be problematic because for multiple reasons. For one thing, it's there are other heresies that are dealt with at these councils that those could arise again, or they could try to take root again within the church. Secondly, it kind of one of the things that the Athonite Fathers are concerned with is the idea that Holy Tradition is a constant stream, and therefore you have to locate it somewhere. So if we're saying that these additional councils are unnecessary, we're saying that that stream of Holy Tradition through the Orthodox Church, it kind of stopped, or these things were unnecessary. They can kind of fall away. And so they particularly took issue with a flippant remark they quote from Pope Shenouda. Pope Shenouda was recorded as saying to the Chalcedonian Orthodox, he said, "You have 7 ecumenical synods. If you lose one, you're not losing a lot." So this kind of flippant remark and this kind of attitude, well, it's no big deal. We can just kind of agree to disagree, I think is why there was a lot of concern about the way this is being handled. And in addition, the later councils, the fourth, fifth, and sixth councils, they kind of all interlink within the Eastern Orthodox tradition. They all build on one another, and they're an extension of the same thing. It's kind of the same way that Nicaea and First Constantinople, the first and second ecumenical councils, they completely lock together. In fact, the creed is oftentimes referred to by its full name as the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed because this definition of Trinitarian theology that extended over these two councils has to fit together. And I think the way that we understand in the Orthodox Church Christology, it can't rest on Ephesus alone. It's something that makes sense through the subsequent councils, including the seventh council, which the incarnation then is connected to reality and the way we depict Christ, and issues regarding how relics and things like that participate in God because of the incarnation. So all these things are interconnected. I don't think that we can do away with those councils, and that's what the Athonite monks are really saying, is that it has to be a true union in which these councils are agreed upon, and that's the only way to move forward.
Yeah, and it's really kind of sad to me because if you were to get several scholars, the Eastern Orthodox and the Oriental Orthodox Church, into a room and you begin to talk about Christology and the proper use of St. Cyril's words and how to interpret one incarnate God, the Word, how there's probably going to be a lot of agreement. I mean,
Absolutely,
even based on what I have already picked up in my interviews, I see very little that they don't agree on, that you and they and me, whoever, I don't count, but that we don't agree on. And so it's really more a matter of the past. And, one of the statements talked about, we hold the same faith, quote, that we've always held. Well, that's problematic, obviously, because there was a time when it wasn't obvious that we were talking about the same faith. It's more obvious now. And a lot of it, I'm sure, is language, but we can't just brush that off. So it's unfortunate.
What I would hate to...
Go ahead.
Well, I would hate for... there are statements that the Roman Catholic Church has made in the past about its relationship with Byzantine Catholics, right? And so, for example, why do the Byzantine Catholics not have to include the filioque in the creed, right? This is, and statements, the statements are usually like, well, they have just an older, less, more primitive version of the theology. So, and I would hate for that to be the case, right? That like if we reunify like a false union, it would have this sense like, well, those Oriental Orthodox, they just stopped at the third, and they just have a less primitive, less advanced, less, crystallized faith than we do. That's essentially what would happen. It would create second-class citizens within the communion of churches. And, we're not talking about just some local provincial synods, like there were local synods in Russia and, in other parts of the Orthodox world that were never taken up as universally binding. There were local synods for various things. We're not talking about that. We're talking about major councils that were international, that bishops from around the world attended at these great councils, dealing with major theological issues that need to be, we need to have those decisions, remaining in place so that we can prevent entering into those heresies once more, having to go back and reinvent the wheel. We've already dealt with these things. So why need we go back and kind of like say, oh, they're not necessary. And then some of our brethren, if they, become part of we become unified in one church, what are we going to say? Like, they don't need these councils, and therefore they may end up going through the same thing all over again that we've already experienced in our history.
Yeah. And if I were a theologian, and I'm not, I would want to ask the question, well, tell me specifically about what is heretical in the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th. You rejected the 4th and the 5th, and then the 6th and the 7th, and some of them you weren't even there. Tell us what specifically you reject about that. And let's get to the terms. Let's understand each other. And I don't know, just like we're so close, but so far.
Yeah. And probably, a lot of these things are rooted in historical happenings. There was, so under Emperor Justinian, all these attempts to try to reunify, but then there were some things that didn't work out right. There was parallel hierarchies being established, and one side or the other persecuted each other. And so there's, kind of the same way that the Fourth Crusade in 1204, looms large in terms of relationships between the Orthodox and the Roman Catholics. The tragedy that happened in that crusade. So, the Orthodox is an historically rooted church, and sometimes we do need to go back and sort out these histories and make sure we know what we know, because sometimes these things get passed on for so long in some sort of exaggerated fashion that we need to kind of sort out the facts and details once more. But there were tragedies that happened, and there were things on both sides, and a little tit for tat and so forth that gets kind of ossified, those tensions. And someone born today can say, well, that has nothing to do with me.
Yeah.
That's a nice way to approach it, but unfortunately, the moment they start reading the history and they kind of drudge up these things again, it comes back to haunt us. We have to figure out a way to move past those things and get down just to the theology.
Yeah.
We have to get down to the theology and say, let's look at the theology. And I think that's the better way to approach this.
Good point. Well, as always, this has been incredibly fascinating. You are a very effective teacher, Father, and I appreciate so
Oh,
much you helping us understand these things and sort through them. And I appreciate your irenic spirit and your obvious desire for unity, but you're also protective of the heritage of the church as well. So thank you. Anything final words that you'd like to share?
no, I would just add that we need good scholars. People who love the Lord, who are rooted in the faith on both sides of this. Both sides of this to be the people sitting down together. Uh, like you said, being cautious but optimistic, and having a true union in mind. And then I think that good things can happen. I think that not much has really moved since the 90s that I'm aware of, maybe some small little things back
Yeah.
and forth, but
Well, and
it
you
seems
wonder
like
how
it's kind
much
of fallen.
political intrigue has played into that. There's a lot of tensions in the
Hmm.
world, and these bishops are busy putting out fires. So,
Right, exactly.
well, thank you again, Father, and
Oh,
we'll
my
look
pleasure.
forward to calling on you again. You've always been very willing to participate with us, and we appreciate it.
Thank you.